everybody. We got a great one today, for a change, because my guest is Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Molly O'Toole, whose beat is immigration. I was on the Judiciary Committee where in 2013, we in the Senate passed comprehensive immigration reform. But of course, it never made it to the House. Now, in the past week, Kristi Noem, the head of the Department of Homeland Security, she's the one who shot her dog. Kristi Noem revoked temporary protected status for 350,000 Venezuelans currently living in our country, although I'd be willing to bet that it was Stephen Miller's idea. Anyway, my guest, Molly O'Toole, will talk me through what this means for those 350,000 Venezuelans who have been under temporary protected status. But before we get to that, I just want to touch on the exciting news we got from President Trump, who announced during his press conference with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, Trump announced his brilliant plan to turn Gaza into the Riviera of the Middle East. And unlike our complicated immigration system, this plan is brilliant in its simplicity. All that it involves is deporting approximately 2 million Gazans to Jordan and Egypt, where they can live comfortably and, most importantly, safely. Then the United States would rebuild Gaza and turn it into the Riviera of the Middle East, a win-win. But how about a win-win-win? To rebuild Gaza, we use the labor of thousands of highly skilled, undocumented immigrants currently working in the building trades back in the old US of A. Then, select the most promising teenagers of those skilled workers and train them right there in Gaza to be the astronauts Elon Musk will need to man and woman the 8-month SpaceX flights to Mars. There it is. Pretty simple. Move the Gazans to Egypt and Jordan. Rebuild Gaza to be a top flight vacation destination using skilled, undocumented labor. Move SpaceX headquarters from Texas to Gaza and give the best astronaut training to their smartest kids for our missions to Mars. In a decade or two, SpaceX will have established a colony that is self-sustaining, growing its own food, and most importantly, providing a base for mankind's survival if, say, an asteroid, like the one that killed the dinosaurs, were to strike the Earth. Just trying to think a little outside the box. You're welcome. Okay, now let's talk about our fucked up immigration system with Molly O'Toole, a great one, for a change. I'm wondering how the Trump administration is going to handle immigrants who are now entering the country, to those who have been here for years, maybe even decades, but still may not be here legally. How many people are we talking about?
Well, the undocumented population has been estimated to be around 11, 12 million. I should note that in the last couple of years, there has been a pretty dramatic increase to the foreign-born population in the U.S. that does have a lot to do with migration in recent years. So some more recent estimates are around 13 million, for example. And actually, the estimate suggests that the foreign-born population in the United States is at some of the highest levels it has been since the 1850s, but that's still around 15%.
And who are the people in charge of immigration for this administration? There's Tom Homan. He's the border czar, right?
Right. Tom Homan is the border czar. It should be noted that he was the head of ICE briefly under the first Trump administration, and then the Trump administration pushed him out of that position, which is interesting. I think that the most important one, really, who sort of holds the reins on all of this is Stephen Miller, who has a more powerful role this time around. He's one of Trump's main speechwriters as well.
He's deputy chief of staff as well, right?
Right, but also really has significant roles when it comes to the Domestic Policy Council, as well as a lot of other positions in the White House. He's much more powerful this time around in terms of his purview. It really touches everything.
Atlantic writer Adam Serwer coined the phrase, the cruelty is the point. I see Stephen Miller's face when I hear that. That's what pops in my head when I hear the cruelty is the point. People are afraid, clearly.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's very much a climate. And, this really did begin before Trump was elected, but especially among the population that you're talking about, the undocumented population within the United States, but even just immigrant communities who are not necessarily undocumented or U.S. citizen family members of immigrant families, mixed status families. There's very much a climate of fear. And I don't think it's just within immigrant communities. I mean, there's truly a climate of fear that's being created, and I would argue intentionally created across the country, whether from, the federal offices in Washington, D.C., all the way to Aurora, Colorado.
There are Venezuelans in Aurora, right?
I find these stories remarkable. And this sort of just is the story of immigration in the United States, right? These communities will form in sometimes what seem to be unexpected places. So a lot of Venezuelans went to Orlando, for example, Orlando, Florida. A lot of Venezuelans went to New York City, but also a lot of Venezuelans went to Colorado. They went to Utah, Salt Lake City, Aurora, Colorado, Denver. I mean, these are locations that a lot of Venezuelans ended up arriving for a number of reasons. The people that I met along the way in 2022, a lot of them were headed to Colorado and to Utah because of congregations. They were evangelical Christians, and there were pastors and communities that they had connected with.
Oh.
So I think this is sort of remarkable.
And now that there is been a change in their status, right? This past week, the head of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, revoked temporary protected status for 350,000 Venezuelans. And what does that mean for these people exactly?
So what temporary protected status means is sort of what it says. It's supposed to be deferral from removal. Like you can't be removed so long as you hold this status. And it's continually reviewed and extended based on if the conditions, and so it's for natural disasters. It's sometimes for political circumstances. It's sort of a wide array of categories that TPS will be given for.
This is certainly political circumstances and economic in
Right.
Venezuela.
That was the original issuance of TPS for Venezuelans. So it gets continually reviewed or extended, but it was always seen as sort of a legally vulnerable area. The Trump administration 1.0 tried to go after TPS with sort of mixed results in the courts. The argument has been these were intended to be,
temporary.
Really a temporary status. Okay. And for some people, they've been extended for decades. But for most of the Venezuelans, they've arrived in the last several years. And so this is a premature getting rid of TPS. And what it means is they're vulnerable to removal. They're vulnerable to deportation.
So Noem ruled that there's no longer a crisis in Venezuela, an economic crisis. That's what she ruled.
I believe that they ended it, not essentially suggesting that the crisis has even ended in Venezuela, but ended it arguing that TPS in and of itself is not legal by their viewpoint, even though TPS originally was created by Congress as a category. One of the other things with Venezuelans is even if they had canceled their TPS, for example, so they never longer had this status, Venezuela was not accepting returns of Venezuelans.
But now he will, right? Maduro said he will.
Now he will, exactly. So I think right before, even timing-wise, if I remember correctly, before the announcement that TPS was being canceled for hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans, they made the announcement that they had talks and that Maduro had agreed to take Venezuelans back, which is pretty ironic given the stance, the foreign policy stance of the Trump administration, and particularly the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. His stance against Venezuela is sort of a direct contradiction with this idea that Venezuelans can be safely sent back. I mean, there's this principle called non-refoulement, and you'll have to excuse my bad French pronunciation. It's in international law, but it's also in U.S. law. And it basically says you can't send people back to where they're going to be persecuted or harmed. And on the one hand, you have the U.S. government, the Marco Rubios and others saying, this is a dictator who violates human rights and is a criminal in Venezuela. And even has advocated for regime change in Venezuela. And no one's pretending those elections have been valid for Maduro, particularly the last one. but they're sort of advocating for regime change, encouraging the Venezuelan people to
This is our State Department.
rise up.
Is it?
Our State Department, sort of encouraging the Venezuelan people to rise up. And there has been a lot of political repression, these sort of squads that just disappear people in Venezuela, et cetera, on the one hand, but then on the other hand saying, no, it's perfectly fine. We can send Venezuelans back there. So this is sort of one of those contradictions.
How does this work? How do 350,000 people, do they have to get themselves back to Venezuela, or can they, and they can go to other countries? They're just, as long as they leave the United States?
Well, it's a really good question as to how this is going to work out. Presumably, if their status has been canceled, then they don't have legal status anymore in the U.S., but they should still have access to, for example, they could try and then claim asylum. If they haven't applied for asylum, they could maybe then go on that track and say, look, we can't be sent back.
Well, I want to get into asylum because to me, the backlog on asylum is one of the problems that we huge problems that we have in this country, and one of the reasons that our system is broken.
As you noted, the asylum, it has been the sort of primary driver for migration to the U.S. over the past several years, where you have the overwhelming majority of people who are coming to the U.S. are actually turning themselves in to border authorities in order to access asylum, which is a right under U.S. law, not to win asylum, but to access asylum.
What I want to know is, like, how long are you on the waiting list when you come in and you access asylum? How long will it be till your case is heard?
That's not an easy question to answer because it could depend on all kinds of factors. What's your nationality? When did you enter? Are you part of a family unit? Are you a single adult male? But what I can say is that there are 3.7 million cases pending in the immigration court system, and it's an average of almost 2 years to get a decision. And the significant number of those millions of cases are asylum cases. People are usually entitled to several hearings, an initial hearing, and then a final hearing before a judge. You know, I've met people of different nationalities, for example, Afghans that crossed the border in 2022 who worked for the U.S. government, essentially evacuated themselves through a dozen countries in order to get to the U.S. border and try and access asylum. People who still have not had their first hearing. They crossed in 2022. They still haven't had their first hearing as of 2025.
So now the backlog is, you say, what, 1.5 years now or something like that. So in those 1.5 years, they have to check in every once in a while, or do they go wherever they want in the U.S. and work, or what?
Yeah. So when they arrive, they give an address. And then if they move, they have to file a change of address with ICE. So the government knows where they are. They have a year to formally apply for asylum, and they have to do it within that year after they arrive. And as soon as they apply for asylum, then it starts this clock, which in 180 days, I believe it is, but in practice is much longer. Then they can get access to a work permit, and then they can get access to a social security card. So they were legally permitted to enter the country. They have an ongoing court proceeding for their asylum claims. And then after a certain period of time, they're allowed to start working. They have a work permit. So these are legal immigrants, despite what the rhetoric has tried to create, this idea that asylum is not a category of legal immigration. It is a category of legal immigration. But like, as you said, you know, there's 3.7 million cases in the backlog. And on average, it's going to take about 2 years for someone to get a decision, to get a final decision. But in my experience of meeting people along the way, many of whom have crossed in 2022, it's been far longer than that.
Let's say they have their hearing.
Yep.
And it's the judge says no.
Mm-hmm.
What happens to them? Are they escorted out of the country, or
no,
to the border? What happens to them?
They're not escorted out of the country immediately at that point. Then they have access to an appeals process. So if they lose, they can file for an appeal. When people come to the border and seek asylum, they're already put into a removal process. This is a little confusing, but essentially they're put into a removal process, and then the onus or the burden is on them to prove to the U.S. government that they shouldn't be removed because they need protection, that they qualify to stay for some reason.
Well, if they were turned down for asylum, it must be hard to prove that they need protection, it would seem.
Right. Well, I mean, that gets into a lot of things about, you know, the asylum laws were written in the wake of World War II. Like, we live in a very, very different world than when those categories were created. And often people are coming for a variety of reasons. Economic is certainly a motivation, but they're coming for, some of them are impacted by climate change. Some of them are impacted by government persecution. Some of it's religious persecution. Some of it's based on their gender, based on their sexual identity. I mean, there's a combination of factors that don't often neatly fit these categories that were created 70 years ago. So it's difficult to win asylum cases.
Okay, so let's say someone has been turned down for asylum and they go through the process and they finally get to the end where it's no,
Yes.
you just don't qualify,
right.
And you have to leave.
So then there's an order of removal. When you cross the border, you're already in removal proceedings. And this is a defense against removal, your asylum claim. And so if you lose your asylum claim, then you would have an order of removal. And there are about, I think the latest estimate I saw was 1.5 million people in the United States who do have an order of removal.
And it sounds like if there's 1.5 million in line for that they don't leave right away.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there are people on ICE's docket who do have orders of removal, who are in the interior of the country. But again, the order of removal, there is a process in order to get that order of removal. And so it does take a long time to remove even one person if they have exhausted all of their potential recourses against it.
Okay. So ultimately, let's say, how does someone get deported? So it's been adjudicated that they should be deported, and they take their ankle bracelet and say, escort them to the Mexican border, or what happens?
It's about 350,000 removals on average. And this was under Trump administration, Biden administration. The most removals actually happened under the Obama administration. But
is that per year, or what is that?
Per year, about 350,000. Okay. The vast majority of those, CBP officials, Customs and Border Protection, can do removals. It's not just ICE. ICE, generally speaking, is in charge of interior enforcement. CBP, which includes Border Patrol agents, they're going to be in charge of enforcement at the border. So of those 350,000 on average removals, which has been pretty consistent for the past several years, which is mostly based on just what are the resources that these agencies even have to remove people, as we already discussed, it's very resource intensive. The vast majority of those have been recent border crossers because they're often already in detention. So they're easier to remove. They're cheaper to remove. It's faster to remove them because they more recently crossed the border. And that can be done either by CBP officials themselves, or CBP, because they have limited holding capacity, hands them over after they cross the border, hands them over to ICE, who puts them in detention, and then ICE removes them. So 2/3 of those removals are not what people are thinking of right now, which is, these ICE raids around the country. Also, for that category of interior enforcement for ICE, the vast majority of those are not these sort of workplace raids, community raids. The vast majority of those are local law enforcement picking someone up, running their name and ID through national security systems, immigration systems, and then ICE essentially gets flagged and the local and law enforcement says, hey, we got one of yours. And so from jails where they're serving out something else, that's actually the most common way in which someone is removed. Not these raids, because these raids often don't end up, they're shock and awe. They can tear the fabric of a community, but they're very resource intensive for ICE, especially because they don't often end up getting very many people through those. The other thing they can do, they can try and pick people up at their ICE check-ins. And that's something they've talked about doing, is picking people up at their ICE check-ins when they come to that office.
What does that mean?
When they come to the ICE office to do their check-in, which they're mandated to do to try and either keep their status in the good, or their work permit, in the good, whatever, because you can have an order of removal and still have a valid work permit. It hasn't expired yet. You wouldn't be able to renew it, but you still have a valid work permit. So one of the things they have talked about doing is picking people up when they come to their mandated check-in with ICE. But obviously what that will do is then encourage people not to go to their ICE check-ins and send people further underground. And then there's a lot of controversy, obviously, between local law enforcement and being compelled to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement.
It sounds very complicated and must be very hard for people to follow it, these immigrants, but I guess they know other immigrants and they figure it out themselves. Is that what goes on? But let me ask you about the 350,000 Venezuelans. When will they have to leave the country? And how will they leave the country? They don't have to go to Venezuela, right?
I think it's effective starting immediately. And as far as I know, there will be litigation around that, I imagine. But no judge has said, hey, you can't do this. So as of now, they don't have that legal status. They always have the option to essentially, quote unquote, self deport or turn themselves in to get a plane ride back to Venezuela, for example.
Now, who would pay for the plane ride? Would that be
U.S. taxpayers. And these are
U.S. taxpayers?
incredibly expensive. Other places they could potentially go, if they're recent border crossers, the U.S. could try and push them back to Mexico, because now we have remain in Mexico as a policy that's once again in place. Mexico had agreed and seems to be willing to continue the agreement to accept Venezuelans, for example, and other nationalities, mostly Spanish speaking. Colombia has also agreed to take back Venezuelans. That was mostly in the context of when Venezuela had not agreed to take back Venezuelans. So now they can also return to Venezuela, but I believe that option is still in place. And then there are ongoing discussions with other countries to essentially force them to sort of offload other nationalities, including Venezuelans, such as El Salvador, which is, I think, the most recent place that Secretary of State Rubio has touched down. So there are a number of options. It's not clear yet, right? It's really not clear yet where people will go. This is very recent. They can also essentially decide to try and stay, but it makes them vulnerable to being picked up and removed at any time.
Makes them a target. I mean, that for immediate removal, I suppose. Trump did an impromptu press conference on Wednesday in the Oval Office and went on and on characterizing immigrants as vicious, violent monsters who were sent by other countries from prisons and insane asylums. That's not true, right?
He's pretty obsessed with that particular line about being sent, that, we're being sent criminals and people from asylums. There's no evidence to indicate that that is the case.
I think he got that from the Mariel boat lift, because I think that Castro had sent some people from mental institutions.
Well, but actually, I want to push back on that, because there wasn't necessarily evidence that that was even the case. Could there have been some people among that population of Cubans? Yes, but it's really about this rhetoric that can be used to justify essentially extra-legal, extrajudicial actions against these people. And I think what a lot of people don't understand is immigrants have rights. Immigrants have constitutional rights. And so one of the ways in which that was used in the Mariel boat lift, which actually is really important to note because it lays the groundwork for a lot of what we're talking about today, is the U.S. held them indefinitely. And then there were riots at the time. They were being held in prisons. They were being held indefinitely because the U.S. argued essentially that they weren't on U.S. soil. And so the same laws didn't have to apply to them because they weren't on U.S. soil. It's called the entry fiction, that they hadn't actually entered the United States.
They were in their boats?
Yes.
This is before their boats were allowed to dock and they were allowed to get on land.
Yes, and they're on land, but the U.S. argued that they hadn't ever entered the United States. You had Cubans who were held for decades upon decades upon decades and weren't allowed to challenge their detention on constitutional grounds, because essentially the argument, it's called the entry fiction, was that they'd never entered the United States. This is the similar arguments to what the Trump administration is trying to use now, for example, to send people to Guantanamo, because there isn't enough detention capacity in the United States. Enough detention beds. ICE is only funded for about 44,000 beds right now, and they're already full. So they're talking about expanding the capacity at places like Guantanamo, on military bases, et cetera, et cetera. It raises all kinds of legal questions.
Now, who are they talking about sending to Guantanamo?
We, of course, don't have the details on any of these things. We don't have the details. All we have is Trump's rhetoric, like violent criminals, worst of the worst. We don't know exactly who. I mean, they had photo ops yesterday with sort of tattooed, I believe, Venezuelans. We don't have details on what criteria is being used, if any, to send people to Guantanamo, where they were detained, for example. I mean, it's never been used in this way before, that people detained on U.S. soil have been sent to Guantanamo. Guantanamo has been used as a much smaller scale from a migration context for people who have been interdicted at sea, but it's never been used before for people who actually made it onto U.S. soil. But all of this language, no details about criteria, which law is being applied, under what authority, with what money. We have hardly any of these details. We just have the language that's being used to create this idea of criminality, of danger, of conflating national security concerns and terrorism and invasion. And all of that is intended to get around the law and give essentially a blank check where he can try and take essentially military assets or military funding, which is the most funding within the federal government, and try and apply it towards his goal and Stephen Miller's goal of getting rid of as many immigrants as possible.
Let's talk about how many immigrants that don't have status that they are wanting to deport, and how many they will be able to. Now, you said there's something like 11 million, or
11 million is the estimate for the undocumented, unauthorized people without any status. It's closer to 13 million or 14 million when you add in people who have some kind of temporary status. And look, I want to note the reason these temporary status programs exist is because Congress has not passed comprehensive immigration legislation for 40 years.
We tried something in 2013.
And that was the last time it's gotten even close. But everybody's been kicking the can down the road, and that's why these temporary programs exist. They become the sort of fail-safe, the leftovers for in the absence of action. This is what we're going to do. So about 11 million undocumented, 13 million who have undocumented in combination of some kind of temporary status. So it could mean people who have legal status, but it's more these twilight categories that are supposed to be temporary, don't give you any access to citizenship. And then in terms of estimate of people in the country who are foreign born, which doesn't mean that you aren't a U.S. citizen or that you don't have legal status, that's probably around 15 million. They have promised a full range of things. They've said, we're going to remove 20 million illegal immigrants. I don't even know where they're getting that number. We're going to remove 11 million. We're going to remove a couple million.
What I want to ask is, how many will they be able to deport? I just want to get these kind of simple questions and simple answers to how many people do you think they will? And I know you're laughing at there's no simple answers, but in general, where that number is going to be, what do you think is actually possible? Because they've basically said we're going to deport everybody who's illegal, and they're not going to be able to, are they?
Right. No, they're not going to be able to, but which is why it's important to give the accurate answer, whether or not it's simple. And I know you're doing a podcast here, and so I'm trying to keep it as tight as I can. But first off, they've been trying to give the impression that all immigrants in the country are illegal, which is not true. But by creating that idea, it makes it sound as if everybody's on the table, nobody is safe, and that the American people will be fine with it because, okay, well, these are illegal immigrants. So that conflation is intentional. And I'm sorry, but it is complicated, and it's important to complicate the answer to show that it's not so easy as them just promising they're going to remove 11 million people. By some of the best estimates that have been put out there in terms of the resources available to ICE, in terms of detention space, personnel, et cetera, is maybe 1 million a year. Maybe.
Look, they have promised to remove everyone who legally should be removed. And that's, we don't know, 10, 12 million people. It sounds to me like they're not going to do it from what you say. How many will they get out of the country?
I've seen estimates that even if they're able to get a lot of these things that they would need in order to dramatically increase the amount of deportations, that maximum they could do about 1 million a year. I don't think they will be able to do that. I think what we're going to see is maybe a couple 100,000, which is a lot of people. I'm not trying to diminish that, but a couple 100,000 more than we typically see, which is about 350,000 removals. So I think we might see somewhere between 600, 8,000 removals. I don't think we're going to see 1 million per year. It's going to be interesting to see what his own supporters, who presumably, voted for him based on these promises, what happens when they really see how much that costs and what kind of impact it has, not just on communities, but on the U.S. economy, for example.
This administration already has shown that it's willing to take shortcuts. What shortcuts could they take to increase those numbers?
Right.
I mean, can they change the law? It doesn't seem they have to change laws to do things that they want to do right now in this administration after 2 weeks.
That's a really important observation. They're not even trying to change the laws, even though they control, both chambers of Congress. They're just ignoring the laws. So they're ignoring asylum law, although there's litigation about that now. ACLU challenged it and said you can't just declare that asylum is over because you've declared there to be an invasion. And that's one of the biggest things that they're trying to do, because asylum is one of the biggest obstacles. So they're just ignoring that. And if you ignore asylum, that gives you a lot of power. Based on their rhetoric and based on the executive orders, they're leveraging military assets. Okay, that gives you a lot more detention space, a lot more manpower, a lot more planes.
I'm guessing they do everything they can in this regard.
Right.
So assuming that, does that increase the numbers that you're talking about?
I think even with the things they're already trying to do, because some of them are going to get blocked in the courts, some of them won't. That litigation is going to drag on for years. And I think a lot of this, they know they might ultimately get blocked. It's the spaghetti at the wall strategy. It's let's see how much we can get away with in the meantime. So I stand by my and look, journalists should not be in the position of trying to predict a deportation number. That's a dangerous game. But I do stand by my under 1 million a year. And I think we're going to start to see a diminishing of support because it turns out that removing people is hard. It's expensive from a human cost, but also in terms of cost to the U.S. taxpayers.
Well, I think the Trump administration is finding money by, cutting off humanitarian aid to other countries and they're trying to find it other places. And I think this is a number one priority for Homan and Kristi Noem and the rest. So, and especially Trump.
Let me say two quick things. Even with them essentially trying to disband USAID and take all these actions against federal employees, they're talking about like 4%, something like 4% of the federal budget. I mean, it doesn't even come close to the amount of money that you would need for them to actually carry out these actions on deportations. They would need to give DHS a budget bigger than the Pentagon's. I don't think that that's going to happen, in part because I think the American taxpayer eventually is going to say, hey, wait a second, this is really expensive. I don't know if I want all my money to go to that. The last quick thing I want to say is nobody remembers this, but remember way back in 2019, Trump declared a national emergency at the border and led to a record shutdown of the federal government because his own party, which controlled Congress, wouldn't give him funding for his promised wall. He stood up at the Rose Garden and said, well, I just like declaring a national emergency because I don't like to wait. This is faster. Acknowledging that there was no national emergency at the border. He just wanted the money for his wall. He took $15 billion from the Pentagon to go toward his wall, away from the U.S. military and national security to go toward his wall. In the end, he only added, I think it was about 100 miles of secondary and primary barrier. Most of the border was still built under the Obama administration. So he hardly even added to his signature campaign promise.
Okay, I want to start from, again, from the cruelty is the point and what the Trump administration is going to do. What's your sense of what they're going to do? Because they want this to be as difficult as possible for people, and they want to get people out of the country.
Yes. And I think I want to say two quick things, I promise. Al's like, you're not capable of saying anything quickly, and that's probably true. But the cruelty is the point insofar as some of these actions that they're taking, they know they're going to ultimately be blocked in the courts or they won't have enough resources to do them. But the idea is to create enough fear to, one, overwhelm whoever could potentially be suing them about some of these policies, like overwhelm in terms of the litigation, this sort of shock and awe strategy. Which ones are, legal advocates going to choose to try and challenge in court? And the other is to try and create enough fear within these communities that they take certain actions, maybe self-deport or do things like, unfortunately, I've been talking to people who are asylum seekers. They have ongoing legal proceedings, but they're doing things like keeping their kids home from schools, not going to church, not going to work, not going to their own immigration lawyers' offices because they're afraid that they might get picked up, even though in theory they're not supposed to. So the cruelty is the point.
So they don't go to their immigration lawyer because they're afraid of being picked up at their immigration lawyer.
Yes, exactly. They want to go to the immigration lawyer to try and ask questions about how does this affect me? What should I be doing? I want to try and keep my status. I want to try and make sure I stay good with with the U.S. government, but they're not going to those offices because they're worried those offices are going to be targeted by ICE agents. So this climate of fear is part of the Trump administration's strategy to try and do the job for them. And that's why I'm trying to be really careful about my best estimate of what they can and can't do. Okay. So then the secondary thing in terms of the kinds of things they're going to try to achieve, obviously, they're going to try and end all these temporary statuses, these sort of humanitarian parole programs, temporary protected status, these statuses that were always intended to be temporary, that don't give access to citizenship, that were always sort of vulnerable for that reason. These sort of side paths in to the United States. They're legal. Many of them were created by Congress, but they're vulnerable. They're going to try and get rid of all access to asylum completely, which is what they tried to do the first time. In part, that's because asylum is one of the trickiest parts of the law for them to ignore. Asylum is also the overwhelming pathway that people are using to access the United States legally, because it's one of the few remaining legal pathways. That's another thing they're going to try and do. They've already indicated they're going to try and go after access to public benefits, which is something they tried to do the first time, to say, well, even if you're a U.S. citizen child of an immigrant, that you can't access benefits. They're going to try and use military assets to increase detention space, to increase planes. They're going to try and strong arm all these other countries, especially throughout Latin America, to either take back their citizens or take back other citizens, or even, as we saw with El Salvador this week, even though there's no way in hell this is legal, honestly, is to take U.S. citizens.
Wait a minute. They took U.S. citizens who were Salvadoran?
El Salvador announced that they had agreed to jail people from the United States who were either immigrants who were being removed, or even to include U.S. citizens. This is what the president of El Salvador said after Rubio's visit to him. Of course, with all of these things, we don't have any details about what this would actually mean. And that's, like, on its face is illegal. But these are the kinds of things they've talked about doing. They are trying to strong arm other countries into taking back their own citizens, or to take other citizens that are not their own citizens. These are all the strategies they're employing to try and remove people quickly, to try and make other countries do U.S. immigration enforcement for the United States, to create this climate of fear. These are kind of steps that they're going to be taking, and we'll see how they play out.
You hit it with people are afraid to go to their own immigration lawyer is pretty stark.
I mean, as a journalist, I do try and stay away from feelings and try and stick with the facts. But you can't help but being, obviously, we're human beings too, And I think if you give a shit about your job, then you're better at your job. I've been following, for my book, I've been following some of these people for years now, and some for longer, but most of them for at least 2 to 3 years. And I think the most difficult conversation that I have had, since the Trump administration has returned to power, is with a mother who is trying to have a conversation with her very young son about what he needed to do if either she or his father didn't come home. And this is an asylum seeker. I mean, this is a woman who has been through a lot and has an ongoing asylum case. These are the category of people who are in the country legally with the permission of the U.S. government. She works a very difficult job and is having this sort of heartbreaking conversation with her son who doesn't understand. And of course he doesn't understand. And I do think some of these steps that are being taken in terms of the precedent that's being set here, undermining our institutions, ignoring the law, are extremely troubling and have historical echoes. But I'm also trying quite hard, and I think it's our responsibility as journalists, as public figures, to really try and right-size this, just so you're not doing the job for them in terms of creating this climate of fear. If cruelty is the point, not adding to the cruelty by, kind of speculation, but paying really strict attention to what they do versus what they threaten to do. Those kinds of things, because you don't want to contribute to the sort of propaganda of fear that's being created. And we saw this the first time. This was part of their concerted strategy, and they're very successful at manipulating the media in order to help do their job for them in terms of creating this climate of fear. But if the last thing I'll say, I promise, the cruelty is the point. That is really, it has been a hallmark of the first Trump administration. But that idea is based on this concept of prevention through deterrence. If we make things as difficult as possible for people, they won't come. That's obviously proven to not be the case. We've had millions of people coming over the past several years, and even under the Trump administration, after family separation, after Remain in Mexico, the most extreme things that had been attempted at the U.S.-Mexico border, they still had one of the highest years that had been recorded for immigration in quite a long time for migration numbers at the border. And then COVID happened. And so the whole world shut down. So my point is, cruelty is the point. Prevention through deterrence. Let's make it as hard as possible for people. I've seen people going through the Darien jungle with entire generations of families willing to die for the chance that they might make it to the United States. If they're willing to die for the chance to make it to the United States, obviously prevention through deterrence and cruelty is the point. They don't even work. So what are we doing? What kind of country do we want to be? Where are we going? It's worth asking, do these policies even work? I think it's fair to say the answer is no. And that's much less than the real consideration about what kind of country do we want to be.
That's very good. That's a great summary. Don't you think?
Well, I said it so short.
No, I hear you there. And yeah, this is heartbreaking. But I like what you said about you don't want to be used by them to stir up more fear.
And I think that the media was used quite successfully, and the media hasn't quite figured out how to cover Trump and how to cover the Trump administration, and particularly in the immigration context, because fear is very potent. It is a potent political strategy to sort of appear to the basest American instinct, and it really is an American instinct about this sort of other. Someone is getting something, and so I'm not getting something. It's part of their strategy, and I don't think the media, and myself included, has figured out a sort of effective and responsible way to cover this administration when the rules don't seem to apply to them and the norms don't seem to apply to them. So what can the media do to responsibly cover this administration? I mean, I don't have the answer to that yet, but I'm working on it.
Great. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. I know it can be frustrating to get into the weeds on this stuff.
Oh, I know.
I think it's important. So.
No, I hear what you just said in these last couple answers really helped me understand why you, were so careful to be inclusive of all the accuracy to make the thing, every answer accurate.
To filibuster.
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening. That beautiful music is by Leo Kottke, the great Leo Kottke. I want to thank Peter Ogburn for producing this podcast. We'll talk again next week.